Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. Today, I want to talk about three dimensions of inequality in China, and they are all dimensions that I've been doing different types of research projects about. The first is poverty, which of course is not the same as inequality, but has some relationship in thinking about the well-being of the people at the lowest part of the income distribution. The second is intergenerational inequality. And the third is the rural-urban divide, which was described as a key component of inequality in China in the last plenary presentation. For each of these topics, I want to describe what I view as the main driving forces affecting that aspect of inequality, and then talk about what have been some of the policy responses by the Chinese government and the policy challenges that lie ahead. This is a plot of official poverty numbers by the Chinese government, and China has had tremendous success in reducing absolute poverty, which is interesting because, of course, during this time, inequality has grown tremendously. And the fact that inequality has still been accompanied by dramatic improvements of well-being at the bottom of the distribution of income is one reason why this inequality has been politically sustainable. Everyone pretty much is being made better off, even as inequality has increased. China has established a number of official programs to address poverty. It's focused mainly on regionally targeted public investment programs. And there have been some evaluations of the effectiveness of these programs and have found that they have improved growth and incomes in the areas where these investments have been concentrated. However, there's a lot of evidence as well that these gains may not have been really distributed in a way that reaches the poorest of the poor, and that there are still many poor people who are not living in areas covered by the official programs and so have not benefited at all from the official poverty investment programs. The most recent World Bank report on poverty, for which I was a lead consultant, concluded that the nature of poverty in China has become very multidimensional. The reasons why different people are poor are quite heterogeneous. Many poor people don't live in poor Western regions. They live in eastern and central regions where the majority of the Chinese population reside. And so there probably needs to be a move away from focusing on poor areas to focusing on poor people and trying to understand, as Steve described earlier in his comments, the underlying mechanisms and the appropriate solutions for those different mechanisms. Now, broadly speaking, although I've just talked about these programs, most of the poverty reduction in China has not been the result of the official programs. Most of the reductions in poverty have been the result of very broad-based increases in rural incomes associated with macro phenomena. In particular, in China, unlike some other large emerging markets, much of poverty reduction has been closely associated with agricultural development because poverty in China is concentrated in rural areas. More recently, however, because migration and wage income have really become the main component of rural incomes, migration increasingly is the key mechanism for people to escape poverty, especially younger people to escape poverty traps. And for that reason, I mean, the only kind of investment or resource you can take with you as a migrant is your human capital. And so I think the focus on poverty reduction really needs to focus much more on human capital dimensions. Scott Rozelle, who couldn't be here unfortunately, has been doing a lot of very interesting work in rural China, documenting that in the very poorest rural parts of China, there are still very fundamental types of failures in human capital investments in very basic nutrition, in the quality of schooling, in the matching of the types of skills that are being training being provided by vocational schools, et cetera. And other work has found that if you come from a very remote rural area, the chance that you could be successful in the educational system and get to college and get to an elite college is almost, I mean, your chance is vanishingly close to zero. So despite the fact that China does have meritocratic college entrance rules, the differences in opportunity hit children at a much earlier age and make it very difficult for the type of upward mobility that you might like to facilitate the process of poverty alleviation. Okay, let me talk next about intergenerational inequality. And I just want to point out an interesting fact that comes from the first national wave of the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study, which is run out of Peking University. We're working, I'm an investigator on this project. We're drafting a kind of summary report of some of the main findings of the first national wave. And it's a very high quality study. The data is publicly available, so I encourage anyone who's interested to go online and apply and download the data. We find that the poverty rates, if you measure it either by consumption or income levels, is quite higher for older people. So by consumption, looking at the left figure here, the poverty rate for the elderly, those over age 60, is 25.4% for the elderly. And if you look at the kind of older group is just below the elderly, it's 17.2%. And income, those are the income numbers. The consumption numbers, which are probably the more preferred numbers, are 23% for the elderly and 15.1% for the older individuals. And one of the reasons why there is greater poverty for older people in China is that in a rapidly growing economy, the incomes of younger people actually are a lot higher than the incomes of poor people, of older people. And also that China has yet to establish the type of public pension and other programs that really provide resources for especially rural people in older age. On the right-hand panel is a figure which describes how poverty changes as you kind of add different types of income sources or financing sources to the elderly. So I want to focus on the right-hand part of the right panel, which is for rural households in China. If you just look at the individuals, the respondents to the survey and their spouses, this green bar, and look at their per capita income relative to the poverty line, 2/3 are poor, 65.2%. But of course, in China, many people live with their children, and if you pool their income with their children's income, and then look at whether the income per capita is below the poverty line, poverty falls to 43%. If you then add in the private transfers that older people are receiving from children and others who live outside of the household, then poverty falls again to about 35.4%. And then if you add in the public transfers from all different types of public subsidies, it goes just a little bit further down to 32.8%. And then finally, if you look at the actual expenditures of the families that older people live in, the elderly live in, then the poverty rate goes down to this 28.9%. And so one conclusion from this figure is that it's still very important the support that children are providing through co-residence and private transfers. Those really help many elderly avoid poverty and consumption. The public role actually is surprisingly small in rural China, where most of the poverty remains. Now, the government has responded with a number of programs in rural areas to expand kind of social protection and social insurance. And the most important for older people is a new rural pension program, which is being scaled up and probably is reaching close to national coverage as we speak. And some preliminary analysis from the Charles study finds that that has actually also provided an important income boost for poor people. Older people in China in the future are increasingly going to have very much fewer children, of course, because of family planning. And so relying on these private supports, as today's elderly do, today's elderly still have quite a number of children. But tomorrow's elderly will have maybe half as many children or even fewer. And so for China really needs to put in place these public support programs in time when these kind of older individuals who lack private support mechanisms are going to be really needing financing support for their consumption. Okay, and so that's a big challenge in China. And finally, I want to say a few words about the rural-urban divide, which was also discussed by one of the speakers in the last session. The left panel here plots the urban-rural real income ratio, and you can see for the most part, as is well known, this has been increasing over time in China. There was a bit of a decline in the late 90s, mid-90s, and there has interestingly been a decline in the last couple of years in 2010 and 2011. And the reason there has been, this by the way is still a very high ratio. Urban incomes are still more than 3 times greater than rural, which is an extremely large gap in any type of comparative context. But this decline is a bit promising in the last couple of years, and it reflects, in my view, mainly the rapid increases in the wages of unskilled workers, of migrant workers. The labor market has tightened up quite a bit in China. Wages are going up by 20% or more each year. The question, though, is whether this recent reduction is really a turning point and will continue to decline, or whether this is just a temporary blip down and then forces will continue to pull it up. I'm actually quite optimistic that it is a real turning point, because fundamentals in the labor market have really turned in a way with success that, you know, there won't be cheap labor in China in the future, and that the wages of unskilled workers going up very fast is going to help contribute to a reduction in inequality, because rural-urban inequality is probably the biggest part of overall inequality in China. The other interesting aspect of this is, however, that China still has this residential permit system, this hukou system, that treats rural people differently than urban people and leads to inequality and opportunity for education, jobs, housing, social protection, etc. Li Keqiang has proposed an urbanization strategy to promote economic growth in China as a key way to shift the driver of growth away from export-led growth to domestic growth. And everybody, all the top policy people in Beijing now are scrambling to come up with details of how to implement this idea of urbanization to sustain growth. And what's interesting is that, at least in the discussions I've had with people at the World Bank and others who are trying to provide inputs into this discussion, this could provide a way to really make progress in eliminating more of the barriers to migration and these differences by hukou, to create a truly unified hukou system in the future for China. But, of course, the idea to actually push urbanization from the standpoint of the government leadership is a very risky strategy. If you start really moving large populations into urban areas, it creates a lot of pressure on those areas. And I also think the government will need to really focus on not just, and I think the focus right now is just on this urbanization catchword, but for that to be a sustained process, there needs to be jobs for these people, high quality jobs. And so we get back to these issues about how China can promote competition and innovation in a way that's going to produce good quality jobs, and a lot of them to support and provide a pillar for urbanization to be successful and inclusive in the future. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Only because of the organization of the topic, I think. Do you mind? Are you okay? So in my incompetent handling of the session, I'm delighted to introduce Zhang, who's a professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. The reason for the shift in ordering was to first talk about cross-sectional lifetime inequality, second, more intergenerational considerations, and third, political economy. So there was a method to the madness. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, thank you, Steve. So this is based on a paper we are working on for a June conference in Beijing on inequality with my 2 former students. Some of the slides will look like what Albert has presented. I guess that's the reason why we switched the order. Okay, so here is a first slide to show the situation in China. On the one hand, the miracle economic growth in the last 3 decades is showing in that GDP growth thing. It's very significant change. On the other hand, the Gini coefficient has also increased significantly over this period, as we see here. So this is two opposing things. Well, on the one hand, the economic growth is very significant. On the other hand, the inequality has also risen very significantly, which is not necessarily bad, because perhaps part of the increase in inequality is the price we have to pay for moving towards a market economy. But we will talk about what are the factors driving the inequality later on. But as Albert emphasized, the main thing in China is, although the inequality has risen tremendously like this, all the people benefit from the economic reform. So in absolute terms, even the very poorest people, they are also they are better off than before. But the question is, the rich people, the people on the top, they benefit a lot more than the poor people. And that makes this income situation worsening, and which cause social unrest and many things associated with this issue. So I'm going to talk about 2 things. One is intergenerational educational inequality. And then I will also briefly talk about intergenerational income mobility. So 2 things, educational mobility and income mobility. And in the educational mobility, we will describe the pattern, because earlier we thought it's only 15 minutes. So I cut my slides from 60 slides to 10 slides. Still overshooting the 5 allowed slides. Turns out that one speaker couldn't come, so it's okay, 10 slides. So, okay. So there will be a lot of pattern description. And we will see the intergenerational mobility in education is declining, especially after the 1990s. Okay. And the decline in educational mobility is a main issue in the rural and western areas. Okay, so in the poor areas, the mobility is declining more. That's what we find. In the coastal city, in the east city, in the urban, the Gini, the income inequality is not worsening. It's in the poor area, in the western area, in the rural area, the inequality seems to be worsening. And income inequality is also very high. We find it's around the magnitude of 0.3 to 0.4 in terms of elasticity compared to the literature. So this is quite high. And the decomposition shows that the mediating factor from parental income to child income in terms of education and party membership, the importance increased through the children's education and party membership. But through the children's occupation, on that route, it seems to be declining. And we will see a little bit more later. Okay, so let me now present you some stylized effects we find in the data. So the children's possibility of graduating from junior high school and the parental schooling years. So this is a diagram which shows whether the parental education affects the probability of the child graduating from junior high school. And this is using the census data, 1990, 2000, and the mini census 2005. So, and as we see, overall, the relationship between parental education and the child education is rising, which implies the intergenerational mobility in education is declining. Right? If your father has better education, your son also has better education. So that means the mobility is not good. So this is in the reverse order. If this thing is going down, it's becoming smaller and smaller, meaning the child education and parents' education, the relationship is small, then the intergenerational mobility is high. Okay, but here it implies the relationship is going up, so mobility is going down. And father-child relation and mother-child relation, both overall in China, is mobility, intergenerational education mobility is going down. Rural-urban divide. So something along the Albert's diagram. We see, as I mentioned earlier, that the curve down there for the urban, the relationship between parents' education and the child education for the urban is fluctuating a little bit, right, as we see in the down curve there. But for the other curve, which is going up very steeply, is for the rural. So we see in the rural area, the mobility is declining. Okay, so it doesn't matter, what is the magnitude. Of course, the magnitude is also matter. But what really is worrying is the trend in the rural area, because it implies the intergenerational mobility is going down so significantly in the rural area, whatever the reason.
What are we measuring on the vertical axis?
It's still the same as the previous slide. Whether the child graduating from the junior high school, how it is related to the father or parents' education.
So is that a correlation? Let's say 2.5%, is that what that means? 2.5%, 3%, 3.5%?
Yeah, it's a regression coefficient, something like the correlation coefficient, yeah. But because it's a linear probability model, so it's the dependent variable is 0, 1, whether you graduated from junior high school. Yeah, so it's, keep that in mind, yeah. But it's a trend, it's a change in mobility, which we are trying to infer from this diagram. And the regional thing is also a very alarming picture. The two curves down there, so as I said earlier, on the east and the central area, the intergenerational education mobility is fluctuating a little bit, more or less unchanged. But in the western region, the intergenerational mobility, again, is significantly worsening as the picture, the very steep curve. So the relationship between parents' education and child education is highly correlated, okay? Meaning a low intergenerational mobility. And this mobility is declining, is worsening. Okay? It becomes more not so mobile. And the urban rural thing, again, in the rural, here we look at a slight different angle. We look at the parent education and whether the children could attend preschool education. Here is kindergarten. Okay, so in the urban, the relationship is the height is not so high, but in the rural, it's highly correlated. Again, in the rural area, it implies low intergenerational education mobility. And this is reflected in the how parents' education affect children's preschool attendance, which is a very important thing, because preschool education is the most fundamental level you can remedy the poverty in China. Because anything else, middle school or high school or university, it's getting late, and it's getting more expensive and less effective. So actually the best thing to do is to do it in preschool. And we see in preschool in the rural area is very bad. Mobility.
Just make sure we are understanding correct. Are these numbers straightly divisible? So for instance, should I read it so that the rural mobility is 3 times as bad as those in urban areas?
Again, the dependent variable is 0, 1 here, so it's a linear probability model. Yes, I think roughly you can say that way, yeah.
So
It's a linear probability model.
depending on the parent's education, there's a 2% higher probability that your child will go to kindergarten.
For every year of education of the parent.
Okay.
Yeah,
For every year. Okay.
yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. We wonder about the more fundamental causes, which something Albert also mentioned a little bit. And we think it's interplay between the labor market and education reforms. And as you know, in the labor market side, the introduction of the rural household responsibility system, the economic reform, the first thing in China in late 1970s, and the rural to urban migration, and the construction of the SOE, and the emergence of the private sector. A lot of these changes have resulted in the increase in educational returns. So the educational returns have been increasing, which means if you attend additional schooling things in high school or university, the payoff is higher for every additional year with economic reform. And on the educational reform side, the decentralization of the education funding, which means anything before the university are the responsibility of the local government. Okay, and the high education expansion, the increase in education, tuition, and other things. And the bottom line is the cost of education has been increasing. Taking these two sides together, in the urban area, the economic reform has benefited both the poor and the rich people a lot. So in the urban area, we see the Gini coefficient, or we see the intergenerational mobility has not changed much. But in the rural or western areas, the poor people have not benefited so much from economic reform. So they are still under credit constraint. So with the rise in the cost of education, they couldn't afford the school expenses as before. Because in old days, if you go to university, the government pays everything. In my days, when I went to university, there was no tuition fee, there was nothing, And each month we get some money from the government. But since the early 1980s, they changed the whole thing. So this is just as an example. So the poor people couldn't afford such rapid rise in the education cost. So on the one hand, the economic reform does benefit the poor people, but it seems to be the case in the rural area and in the western area. The benefit in the rural area and the western has not lifted them out of the credit constraint. They are still very much under the credit constraint, so that they cannot go to high quality schools or go to university. So in the rural and the western area, the mobility going down. The inequality is worsening. But in the urban area, the reform benefits them more. So they lift out of the poor people out of the credit constraint case, and their parents' income is going up, so they benefit, and the inequality has not been worsening. And we will do a more rigorous analysis later on when we present the full paper in Beijing in the conference. A little bit on the, another thing I want to mention, Albert also mentioned rural-urban migration. There is this huge social issue of left behind children in China. Because a lot of parents went to the city. So what happened is their children are left at home without parents, or without one of the parents at least. So this is what we call the left behind children. And now you go to the countryside, you go to city, you see the slogan on the wall, say the society should pay attention to left behind children. So people are aware of the problem now, because maybe that is a very costly price we have to pay for the rapid economic growth in the last 30 years, because a lot of children are left behind. And if their human capital investment is worsening, then the future of China is really, will be in trouble. Rapid, like this is environmental destruction. You get rapid economic growth, but you destroy the environment. And you get rapid economic growth, but your children, our next generation, their education is not as good. So this is a very significant issue. And we look at this transparency, we see two messages here. One on the intensive margin and one on extensive margin. So on the thing on the left, we see on the where the parents away, how it affects the probability of being in school. Okay, and we see parents being away actually increase the probability of children being at school. So your parents are not home, children are more likely to be in school. So on extensive margin, it looks good. But on intensive margin, you see the school performance, the coefficient is all negative, with star means statistically significant. So where they are in school, but their parents are not around, so they are not doing as well. And I have to move fast. I think I'm good, taking too much time.
You have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes. Okay, I'm doing well then. Okay, finally, education, of course, is what we care a lot. We know the importance of education, but perhaps down to the bottom, what people care more is perhaps nowadays in China is income. So let's look at intergenerational mobility in income. And we see the income is around the magnitude of 0.3 to 0.4 for the cohorts before and after reform. So that once again, so the mobility has been declining, because this again, it describes the relationship between the parents' income and the children's income. A higher estimate, a higher number there means lower mobility. Okay, so before the reform it was 0.3, and after the reform it was 0.4, and it even reached 0.5 in rich families. Okay, very low social mobility. Okay, and then what we do in the last part of the transparency here is we do a pathway analysis. So how much of this mobility or immobility is channeled through to the child? And we look at three factors. One is child education, one is whether the child is a Communist Party member, and third is occupation of the child. And we find the main channel pathway in a statistical brief mechanical sense is through the correlation is more through the education and party membership, but not so through occupation. Okay, and again, that is quite intuitive. In old days, occupation is very important, but nowadays, occupation is not so important, yeah, relatively speaking. So I think I'm done.
Thank you very much. So our last speaker is Dali, who's professor of political science at the University of Chicago, head of the Center for East Asian Studies at Chicago and the Beijing-Chicago Center. He actually asked to go last on the grounds that he was not an economist, but I told him that we were going to be the judge of that. But the serious point is that part of the Inequality Initiative is trying to break these disciplinary barriers. In other words, understanding semi-sectors inequality obviously requires thinking about issues ranging from genetics to neuroscience to psychology to sociology to political science. So it's completely natural that he's one of the pillars of this conference and book. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I do want to make a correction. I'm not head of the Center for East Asian Studies, but of course it's not Stephen's mistake. Somehow that got into the program. I do head the University of Chicago Center in Beijing. Now, for today, I'm going to present some preliminary thoughts on institutions and inequality in China. I worked with my co-authors, Professor Tao Ran, who is an economist at Grantee University in China, and we have been doing a variety of analysis. And in this case, though, we are actually stepping back a little bit just to give some thoughts on, broadly speaking, the institutional changes that have been happening. We all know how the Chinese economy has grown, and so I'm not going to go into these numbers. The Chinese economy has grown as rapidly as the early wave of East Asian modernizers in the early days in the post-Second World War era. But what's interesting is in the 1980s, this was in some ways the golden age of Chinese reform. Deng Xiaoping had the idea to let some people get rich first, that egalitarian poverty is not socialism, and that he emphasized the need to provide some incentives for the people. In fact, it's very much, if you really look at the entire program, there's quite a bit of Hayekian experimentalism in the 1980s. It started in many ways in agriculture with the household contracting of land. And of course, this was very much driven historically by the experiments or push for radicalization, communization during the Mao era. But of course, eventually, and I wrote a book on some of those issues, it led to the dismantlement in the end of the communes. But most importantly, the contracting of land to the household in rural areas led to a boom in productivity. In fact, also increase in incomes in rural areas. So this is something that, from the bigger span of history in the in the reform era, we don't tend to see. But you go back to the Gini's, as I am going to show very quickly. In fact, there was actually a downward shift in the Gini coefficient in the early 1980s. However, I do want to keep reminding us that because of the communist legacy, the legacy of the communist revolution, land remained, in fact, it's actually at the beginning of the reform era, the Chinese constitution included a provision that land is to be state-owned, especially in urban areas. And of course, only the state, cities have the right to requisition land from rural areas for urban development and so on. So as a result, actually, there are a lot of consequences because of this particular institution. But of course, in the meantime, in the early 1980s, there was very significant fiscal decentralization. In fact, there were contracts between the central government and the provinces, which have been extensively studied. But what's interesting is the General Secretary Hu Yaobang in the 1980s up to 1987 was very much in favor of the contracting model. So eventually contracting was extended, was adopted not only actually in the provinces for the households, but also for enterprises and in schools as well. Teachers could be getting bonuses based on the percentage of your students who get into university and so on in this case. At the same time, actually, eventually, there were a variety of other reforms, including the opening of coastal cities and so on. By the mid-1990s, however, there was a mad rush towards building businesses that, in fact, the party, the army, the police, and all that were in fact engaged in business. But what does this mean in terms of the inequality? The decentralization, in particular in the 1980s, had a very serious impact on rising inequality. Part of the reason was the tremendous decentralization, in fact, dismantlement of any effort to provide public services at a more aggregate level. Education, in many ways, have done a collaborative study on this issue very early on. Essentially, public education was privatized practically to the village level in the 1980s, to the extent that, in fact, parents were responsible for the children's education. Of course, that led to dropouts and so on at that particular time. At the same time, in healthcare, again, for however bad it was in the collective era, there were collective rural health clinics, barefoot doctors, and so on. Of course, those mostly disappeared, and healthcare became pay by yourself. Also sort of in the 1980s, and to this day, until fairly recently, actually, there was a very significant sort of privatization. Of course, things have begun to change in recent years. And then there is the privatization of the state sector. Many state enterprises were closed, leased, merged. There was actually only with the Communist Party could the government in fact downsize the state sector so dramatically, leading to the layoffs and furloughs of 30 to 40 million workers from the state sector. All of those, without actually the corresponding social safety net at that point in the 1990s, around that time. So as a result, all of those efforts of decentralization and privatization actually compounded the effort in terms of a lot of the inequalities that would have arisen also with the introduction of the markets. Now again, let me emphasize, I'm not saying that equality in itself is good. In fact, you do need some inequality, a good inequality in terms of providing incentives. But at the same time, in the 1980s and early the 1990s, China went into exactly the opposite direction. And those were compounded by existing institutional barriers and rigidities, especially the urban-rural, as both Albert and Junsen have already emphasized so far. The household registration system and so on kept people, for example, especially including migrants who moved to urban areas, from gaining urban residency, for example. There are also massive differences between the state sector, the public sector, versus the private sector, which I'm going to get back later on. So as a result, there have been a variety of studies of the Gini coefficient. I present several of those different versions. To the left is one based by Professor Li Xu of Beijing Normal University. To the right are numbers. The red ones actually come from the World Bank, but of course, presumably they also come from official statistics. About a decade ago, however, the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics stopped publishing the Gini coefficients for good reason, because China now ranks among the most unequal societies in China. It's only earlier, well, in fact, very recently, that they finally released the numbers last year, so sort of the blue dots. And you can see part of the reason now they want to release the numbers is because they can say, well, look, there has been a little downward slope in the last few years. So you can show how, under the emphasis on harmonious and scientific development under the past generation of leaders, China has begun to correct some of the excesses. But there's no denying, however, that those numbers are extraordinarily high, putting China in the leagues of Brazil, well, less than Brazil, but in fact slightly more, I think, than in the United States. There are also other numbers. The Southwestern University of Finance and Economics with Grantee has done a study, and after all the adjustments they have been able to make, the Gini coefficient is in the 0.6 range. Although we do know the China Family Panel studies, which have only released numbers, but those numbers actually tend to be similar to the NBS numbers. So there are, but there's no doubt currently the Gini coefficients are very high. But you look at the patterns, however, to the right, you can see at the very beginning in 1980, China was below 0.3, and making China, in fact, one of the most egalitarian societies in East Asia generally. And then it did dip with the initial phase of reforms in the early 1980s, in fact. And then things have been going very upward since then. Now, what's interesting, however, is the Chinese government began to realize this was becoming a problem already by the late 1980s and early 1990s. The argument was that, in fact, as the country was developing, you needed to take care of the rest. In fact, then the leadership went back to Deng Xiaoping and reminded people that Deng did not just say, let some people get rich first. Deng also said, in the same breath, that after the first group of people have gotten rich first, then they are supposed to help the others. But at the same time, with the breakout of the former Soviet Union and also Yugoslavia, there was a lot of emphasis, a fear of the center becoming weak. So the argument was the center was, first of all, becoming fiscally weak. It was not getting much money from the economy in order to provide, to help the people, the groups that have become disadvantaged. In this context, China began to push for rationalization and re-centralization. Many of you know of the reforms that were introduced in 1994 with the tax sharing reform system. And the justification partly is not only to strengthen the center, but also to allow the center to be able to provide more transfer payments and better social safety net. And in the end, leading to decreases potentially in inequality. But of course, we've seen how those numbers continue to rise, in fact. Well, here are the numbers in terms of the fiscal distribution to the left. The upper figure is actually how the central government controls the percentage of the budget, the unified national budget that the central government controls. It rose after the tax reforms in 1994. It rose to about 50%. The lower bar indicates government revenue as a percentage of GDP, not counting extra budgetary revenue. And of course, to the right, the reason I want to mention that is immediately after some of this re-centralization, the local governments discovered that they can sell land through auction, and which meant that actually, remember, land is owned, land ownership was defined as state-owned, and therefore there is a strong interest, especially because weak property rights protection for the land. The state can actually expropriate or requisition land from rural areas, resell them, and get a lot of revenue. And of course, we all know the land auction, so the revenue from selling land and also land lease fees are as large as half of the local government budgets. By the last decade, in the last decade or so. So it's a very significant number in this case. But of course, because of this, these institutions demand that those places that have very high land prices tend to be the more developed areas, of course, can have more money. And of course, that means also significant differences in terms of fiscal capabilities and so on. Nonetheless, the fiscal reforms does allow the Chinese government to help gradually remake the social contract. In fact, Albert and Junsen already alluded to some of those. For example, in education, increasing, in fact, already, unlike in the 1980s now, compulsory education in rural areas is free. Textbooks have become free. There's no tuition, and the poor students who stay in schools can get some help with residency and so on. Likewise, there is a very extensive coverage of healthcare, health insurance for the entire population now. In fact, I think today 97% of the Chinese population is covered. The co-pay percent is very high still, But even there is commitment by the Chinese leadership to provide greater coverage. In fact, this year there is greater deepening of healthcare coverage. The rural population also had the agricultural tax abolished by 2006. Not only that, the urban bias in the past is turned around. Now the government actually provides subsidies to farmers for producing grain, for buying machinery, for fertilizers, and so on. Those are not big numbers, but nonetheless, they are a very significant change from the past. And of course, a lot of those are very heavily targeted towards the rural areas. Remember, for the Communist Party, which rose based on social mobilization of the peasants, they also are inherently afraid of the peasants. So there is a very strong political interest in reaching out to the rural population to keep them reasonably happy. And of course, the survey data indicate that the rural population are relatively comfortable in their sentiments. Comparing today from 10 years ago. Another aspect is actually welfare, including for the rural population. Of course, this already began to be built with the minimum livelihood support system for the poorest population in urban areas. Then it began to be extended to the rural areas. And then there was another initiative that is for the families that followed the family planning tradition, policy in rural areas. The government began to introduce a stipend maybe about a decade ago. And now there is a greater effort to provide coverage to the rural population for the elderly once you reach 60 years old. A big challenge is with the family planning policy, more than 1 million families actually are bereft of a child who was born but then lost. And then they could not have another child. So the government now is beginning to have also a commitment to help those families as well. Of course, you create the problem, it's their responsibility to do something about it. But overall, there is a strategy that is to buy peace through growing social commitments in this case. But nonetheless, there are differences because the public sector continued to be very well provided. At the same time, Albert mentioned the emphasis on anti-poverty. Of course, there has been Project 8-7, and which was succeeded by the New Century Poverty Alleviation Program as well. Massive amounts of money have been targeted to those nationally designated counties. Recently, there have been calls for equalizing public services between the urban and rural areas. Of course, if they can do something about Beijing, I think they would do a lot in terms of helping to alleviate the congestion and something like that. But overall, though, there is the rhetoric. And therefore, as we emphasized, if the Gini coefficients can be trusted, then it does appear to have stabilized at elevated levels. But we also know that public disenchantment at this point is very high in China. Now, Choi-Sung Lee, who is a colleague in sociology at University of Chicago, has studied 64 countries. He found that in countries that pursue public sector expansion, democracies tend to have reductions in inequality. But in non-democracies, however, public sector expansion intended to reduce inequality nonetheless does not result in reductions in inequality. In the Chinese case, despite the moderation in recent years, it does appear to fit this model. And in many ways, the anti-poverty program, you look at how the money is spent, it appears the money is not flowing into the pockets, into the incomes of the households. A lot of the money is captured by the bureaucracy to support administrative costs and so on. In fact, contrary to central government intentions. And there are various institutional distortions. The fiscal system continues to favor the rich, especially with matching grants and policy mandates. Socially, of course, the household registration system remains an issue. In fact, the effort to control housing price inflation today reinforces the house registration system, because you have to have a local hukou in order to buy in a city like Beijing now. In fact, you cannot buy a car there now without a hukou, for example. Also, the financial system also, is actually skewed in terms of the savings. Politically, the system is very much emphatic on perks and gradations in a hierarchy. As a result, in fact, today, the top favorite place college graduates wants to go to is to work in the government. In fact, the state sector, of course, have been protected, and as a result, they get higher pay and all that. All those institutions, therefore, continue to engender the kind of inequality, leaving sort of regions, certain regions and sectors behind. And of course, I do want to mention, nonetheless, I'm in agreement with Albert in this case, demographic trends and dwindling labor supply should help labor gain a bigger share over time, nonetheless. I do want to briefly mention, however, that inequality is not simply about income, because a lot of the other issues related to that are very salient in China are also sort of affecting the low-income people. One of the biggest issues, for example, are the environmental damages. Cancer villages are called cancer villages very often because many of the polluting factories are located very close to rural areas. For example, I have a picture of this entire village of people that have been affected by cancer, for example, and there are all those maps of cancer villages. I know I'm running out of time. I do want to bring in Scott Rozelle, who is not here, but he has been emphasizing to what extent China could be potentially sort of trapped in the middle income level. And of course, we know China is massively investing in education, technology, and with massive numbers, 7 million people graduating from college. But the inequality is very significant in this regard because, first of all, high inequality means social polarization, and it reduces the likelihood of greater public participation potentially and reduces the chances of democratization. But in terms of economic development, Scott has presented this figure essentially finding out that those low-income, middle-income countries that graduate to high income tend to have reduced inequality at the 0.33 level. But the aspirers, including China, and there are a long list of them, many of them are found in Latin America, countries that have reached the middle income level, get stuck at the middle income level. And those are the countries that tend to have very high inequality, Gini coefficients at the 0.47 level. China is right there. So that raises profound questions about the future of China. It's not an issue of causality. It could be actually the other way around as well. But it does raise deep, profound questions. Let me end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I hope I'm old enough where I get to say that one of the joys of HCEO is that we have, three of the absolutely outstanding younger researchers in inequality in the world who focus on China. I did also want to mention that we've also have two of the most important senior figures in the study of inequality in China, Li Shi and Lu Mai, as integral parts of this collaboration. And in addition to them, Scott Rozelle, who I think many people would say is the leading American expert on the Chinese economy. So we've been very fortunate. I thank all of you. So I'd like to open up the discussion, or the floor now, for questions, and I will arrogate to myself the right to ask the first one. And that is, if you could talk a bit more about human capital investment levels. As emphasized in work that Jim Heckman has done, despite the massive increase in college enrollments, the fraction of GDP that is spent by the government on education is around 3%, which is substantially lower, obviously, than the United States, for example, in contrast to the physical capital investments. And so, and again, what Jim has emphasized is that the likely rates of return on investment, particularly in early childhood and in rural areas, could be extremely high. So if you could talk a bit about the your forecasts, as it were, for the evolution of public investment in education at the primary level?
My sense is, in fact, the Chinese government had the education law required education spending to reach 4% of GDP. But because the GDP has been growing so rapidly, in fact, the education bureaucracy had difficulty in ramping that up. But it finally did reach 4% last year. My hunch is there's some accounting gimmicks that were done, but nonetheless, there has been massive amounts of money being spent. But I do want to mention my other colleagues would be able to speak more deeply into the issue of returns to education. But one thing that we do need to keep in mind, in fact, is the demographics, because there are fewer children who needs to be educated today. So the same amount of money that are going into education is actually, per pupil, is actually rising as a result, first of all. Secondly, I do detect some sentiments, because, and this is where also inequalities are beginning to rise. The wealthier, compulsory education is for 9 years only. So the wealthier cities are beginning to offer essentially free education up to the high school level. Around the nation, though, it's only 9 years. So this is a big issue. And also, in this case, the kindergarten level, there's some discussion about making kindergarten an integral part of the education system. But it's not reason. For some reason, there have been vested interest in, well, it's not even vested interest. There are people in China who just feel like the government should not be spending as much. They worry about spending too much, like including kindergarten. They prefer to spend on roads, on buildings, on high-profile projects, because those are the things you can invest in and show immediately when you are the mayor, you are the governor. In contrast, investing in education is something that does not pay off immediately and therefore does not always get the priority it should.
Okay, so let me please open up the floor.
Dali, you had some very interesting research on income inequality growing. But did you compare what would have happened to the Gini coefficient had those social spending programs not been in place? Because presumably it would have increased, even more dramatically than now.
Yeah, I'm sure Albert and Junsen can add to this. But of course, these massive social spending programs have only come into place around 2005 or so. They have only been ramping up much more vigorously only in the last 3 years or so, including healthcare and so on. So therefore, I fully agree with you. Without those actually are having an impact, I think, today. Without them, actually, the Gini could be going up further.
Maybe I want to add one point to that, and that is that a lot of the spending the Chinese government is doing won't show up in income data. So if I make education free, it doesn't change your measured income, but it makes a big difference to the spending, how far the money that households have, or if you improve the quality of the school, that will never show up in the micro data in housing. So there is a need to better incorporate the access to the value of the access to these public services, including healthcare and other things, in terms of thinking more broadly about what impact these efforts have had.
Yeah, so in other words, it's much more about expenditure than income.
Please, I'm going to let you self-organize because I can't see who's.
All right, thank you very much for your insightful discussion about the poverty in China. And I think recently some people argue that the return to education actually is diminishing in China. So I'm very particularly interested in this topic. So I would like to consult the panel whether you have some data or research result concerning the return to education at different levels. So in your paper, in Ms. Zhang's paper, you talk about the education to poverty at the junior high school level. So how about the education at the college level or graduate level? So at different levels, probably the return to education may be different So I just want to consult if you have some like research result concerning this area. Okay, thank you.
My sense about the returns to college education, we co-authored a paper that showed the increase up until the early 2000s. But I think about the past 10 years or so, the returns to college have stayed pretty flat at around 9 or 10% per year. And of course, there's been a lot of media attention to the difficulty that recent college graduates have had in getting jobs, and some of them earning very low wages. And I was part of a project that looked at the 2010 census data, and indeed, you do see a pretty noticeable blip up in the unemployment rates of recent college graduates in the 2010 census data, which I actually didn't expect to be quite as pronounced. So that suggests if the labor market's responding to the surplus of college graduates, then you would expect it could put downward pressure. And we do know that the wage of ordinary unskilled workers continues to go up. I mean, anyone who has interviewed enterprises in the last few months, they still say wages are going up 20% a year. And so we should expect, I think, a possible reduction in the returns of the levels of education above junior high school.
Yeah, just to supplement, I think the return is increasing and for the university for many years, at least for the data we look at. But however, for the last 5 or 10 years, because of the expansion of the higher education, so they admit a lot of, much more high school graduates. So now there is a very polarized return to university education, depending on if you can find a job. If you find a job, conditional you get a job, the university school education has still very high payoff compared to high school. I remember it's about 25% higher than high school graduates. But if you don't get a job, then you return. So it's becoming more heterogeneous than before. Used to be university education. You have a university education, you are guaranteed a job. Right? But now the picture is different. But we have a few papers on this issue, depending on if we control for genetic factors, because the part of it is genetic. So education is on one hand is human capital, on the other hand it's also reflection of genetics. So there are two parts to this return. Yeah.
Thanks very much. This is a sort of probably a question which doesn't have an answer, but you hear two stories about Chinese education, right? You hear the stories that it's great math, rote learning, fantastic scientists are produced, and yet when you get to the university level, you don't get the softer skills being taught, you don't get the teamwork, the creativity, all that stuff. You get two very different stories. One, Chinese education is fantastic, it's going to take over the world. Second, it's awful, doesn't prepare people for the workforce. But when we're talking about education in China and human capital formation, it just seems like a very same thing around the world, right? We use years of education to proxy for human capital formation. And I just wondered whether there's any work that's been done to capture or assess the quality of human capital formation in education in China compared to other countries. Like, is the quality of the workforce being produced by the Chinese education system qualitatively better or worse than other countries' education systems? And is it even possible to capture that kind of thing in the work you're doing?
Well, I think it's hard to measure those dimensions. What economists tend to be able to measure is what they've completed and what their productivity is. That said, the Chinese government has done a lot to try to shift from focusing on access to focusing on quality of education with a number of sequenced curriculum reforms. I think some of your criticisms don't apply just to China, but to much of East Asia, actually, in the deficiencies of the educational system in promoting creative thinking. We tried to do a better job in Hong Kong, which is more of a Western-style model of education. But I think, I think both of what you said is true. China has done really well on the PISA scores internationally, and the thing about it is that unlike places like India or Africa, Chinese schools basically function like they're supposed to at all levels teachers show up for school, kids show up, kids spend a lot of time in school, finishing their homework. And so at a basic level, things function, and so they do very well. But I think that is really different than these higher order skills we're talking about, and that's a big challenge, I think.
Well, let me say anecdotally, because in connection with my work in Beijing, we are actually looking at the regulation of Chinese education, especially regulation of international exchanges. I think, first of all, let's keep in mind the Chinese education sector is extremely diverse. So there are very good universities in China that produce some of the top graduates that go into also US graduate schools, in fact, that are very competitive against others, especially in the area of science and engineering. The other aspect is there are a small number of Western-style universities that already have set up shop in China. But the anecdotal information, though, we find is that increasingly parents are not willing to let their children sort of go to university in China. In the past, is the students who didn't do well in the Chinese system. Now is the students who do well in the Chinese system who are aspiring to study abroad. So there is actually a sense of urgency of practical panic among some of the elites in China in thinking about education policy, how to regulate. And I think that provides an indication, because sometimes it's the perceptions that matter. The perception now is Chinese parents are increasingly fed up with the system and want to send their children to study abroad, but partly also because they can afford it.
Yeah, I think your observations are very good. Now we also realize the importance of non-cognitive skill in our education, but it's just the beginning. But it's never too late, right? On the other hand, even in the literature in the West, the quality of the workforce, how it measures the quality of workforce in terms of quality of education, even in the West, the literature is very little because it's so difficult as Albert, whether the graduate from Princeton or whether from Ohio State University, how do you differentiate their PhD degrees, right? How do you measure? They all have 20 years of education, but how do you know which, it's extremely difficult. There are many micro-studies using IQ and other measures of non-cognitive. So micro-studies, there are many more. But on the aggregate level, which you are referring to, the quality of labor force, how it is adjusted for human capital, very little research.
About inequality in China, but I'd like to know what your best expectation is about future inequality. Is it going to rise or not? And if it's going to rise or stay as it is it sustainable?
Well, I could, first of all, I think both Albert and I think we all agree the shifting demographics and labor trends all go well for the, because historically labor's share of GDP has been extraordinarily low in the case of China. And I think that's actually, that situation is going to moderate somewhat. And the Chinese government has also come up with an income doubling plan in the future. So in that sense, there is this serious commitment. So my sense is that this is not going to worsen significantly. If not going to dramatically increase. The challenge now is the inequalities are not simply about income. There are a lot of informal income, but also assets appreciation, and that's becoming a very big issue.
Yeah, I wonder if the panel can give us your opinions about the future of hukou reform. In particular, right now, I'd like to ask who are the main opponents, what are the issues, and if you want to reform, what are the prospects of reforming this system? And then I just want to ask a very, very general question. 10 years ago, we were told to go west. 10 years later, we're now talking about urbanization. So as a strategy of inclusive growth in China, have we kind of given up on the sort of the go west idea. I'm talking about top Chinese leadership. And now we're, talking about stuff like you're talking about, which is about increasing the quality of human capital. So it seems to me it's a very different strategy than what we were looking at 10 years ago.
I think some of the discussions about how to support an urbanization strategy, which the Premier seems committed to, involves very aggressive reforms of hukou. But I think the difficulties, in my view of the political difficulties, are really about who should finance the changing expenditure responsibilities associated with a hukou reform, especially at the city level or the province level. If I'm in a major city on the East Coast and you tell me I have to provide all of the same social protections to migrants as I do to my local residents, that increases my expenditure burden tremendously. And I might say, look, I'll do it if you pay for it, or I'll do it if that province sending those migrants pays for it. But it seems unreasonable for us to shoulder that burden. Of course, in the U.S. context where mobility is much more accepted, I don't think people question whether if someone moves in your area, they're now your local citizen, so you're kind of responsible. But that's not how it has always been in China. And I think the other concern probably is if reforms are too deep and too quickly, that it would lead to a rush of migrants into the city. And I think they want to do it in a very managed way, as they always do in China. And so I think the reform will, I'm sure, be staged and gradual. And I think a suggestion would be to start with the migrants who have already lived in the city for a long number of years, to try to provide them with equal benefits first. And at the same time, the strategy is gradually, and you see this happening, is to improve the social benefits and coverages in the rural side, so the urban-rural differences start to narrow in terms of the perceived incentives that an individual would have to say, just leave my village and go to the urban areas. So I think it'll continue to move in that direction. It's just a matter of whether this government will really accelerate that movement or not. And there are other difficult issues like housing access, where housing prices are now so high in cities. It's an issue about if you're there's certainly an effort now to provide public housing to lower income people, but do you want to include migrants in that group as well? Well, that is a huge, I think, a difficult one to swallow if you're a municipal leader in China. But then what do the migrants do?
Yeah, so you, to add to what Albert has said, you asked two questions. One is about the house registration, the hukou system. The other is about regional policy. The hukou situation is complicated, so to speak, because there have been significant reforms. In fact, it's easy now to move from the rural area to the urban area with hukou if you are in a low-tier city. The challenge is not about moving into the urban area, it's about which urban area, right? If you're in a small city, you want to move in Beijing, you can't do that either, even though you have an urban hukou. So the vested interest, obviously, are the biggest cities, although now they have diseconomies of scale, like the smog, so maybe that would, to some extent, help a little bit in terms of moderating the demand. But overall, though, I mean, it just happens that Beijing has been the city, one of the biggest, most expensive cities in the last decade. It's truly remarkable in terms of the number of people that are coming in that regard. So in that sense, I think it's really, you have differences, number one. Number two, it's no longer, used to be someone from the rural area would die, won't die, but certainly would aspire to have an urban hukou. That's no longer the case because land values have risen. And the assets are worth something in the rural areas. In fact, now in suburban areas around Beijing, for example, it's the people with the urban hukou who cannot move into a village. So the situation has become very complex nowadays as a result of this. Regional policy, I've studied this issue. I wrote a book on it many years ago, but basically it's pork barrel. So you started with the coast, then you began to offer it to other coastal cities. Gradually there are regional policies targeting the west, targeting the northwest, targeting the central. So every region now is targeted. So therefore, then you need all you need is a regional overall policy such as urbanization, because urbanization is reaching every part of the country. But the offices for regional targeting are still there. They're just not very influential. And of course, there is also a national anti-poverty office, which does help channel significant funding. So that's the general situation, because Chinese national leaders do not function in a vacuum. They do have to placate various regional, local interests, in fact.
And there continues to be a movement of industry to the interior parts of China. I think it's not driven so much by these infrastructure investments, but driven by differential wage costs. That because cost of living in the rich cluster has gotten so high, a lot of companies are moving to areas where those costs are low.
Okay, I'm afraid time is arrived, and it's such a packed schedule today. We'll have to have further questions be a bit more informal. Let me again thank the panel for a great time.